Great to be with you, Ingo. Thank you. Honored to be with the group. And so I encourage people to use the chat function, and I'll do my best to keep an eye on it along the way. The way I'm going to present this is there are 5 key leadership lessons or pieces of advice that I will offer. I will do them one at a time, so we will open it up to questions about each one along the way. So that allows for us to have a conversation throughout the full hour, as opposed to just waiting for all the questions till the end. And as Ingo said, if at the end of the session we have gotten through all 5, we will have some space for Dr. Chip, which basically means I'm your leadership doctor. You can ask me questions about anything related to leadership, and we can get specific into some of what you're dealing with right now. Just to sort of elaborate on Ingo's introduction of me. So I started my first company when I was 26. This is a very long time ago because I'm now 59. But I was 26 years old, and I started a boutique hotel company in the early days of the boutique hotel movement in North America. And so that was, I started the company in San Francisco. The company is called Joie de Vivre. The name of the company was also the mission of the company. There are very few companies in the world. Although I like your name, Ingo. The School of Becoming sort of is both the mission statement of your company and the name of your company are the same. So Joie de Vivre means joy of life in French. And so that was our mission. Our mission was to create joy of life for our employees and our customers. And if we did that well, we knew that our investors would be well served. But it was like the investors were in third place. Employees came first, customers came second, and then employees, and then investors third. So I started that company, Joie de Vivre. It grew into the second largest boutique hotel company in North America, and created 52 boutique hotels. And I sold the company at the bottom of the market in the Great Recession in 2010. And then a couple of years later, as Ingo said, I joined Airbnb because the 3 founders asked me to come in and be their modern elder, the person who is the wise person, but also, frankly, from my perspective, the curious person, because I think a modern elder is as curious as they are wise. And I spent 4 years in a full-time role there, really sort of helping guide the rocket ship with the 3 founders as the head of global hospitality and strategy and the in-house mentor to Brian Chesky, the CEO. And now almost 3.5 years later, I'm still a strategic advisor to the company. I'm still the mentor to Brian, the CEO. Obviously, the company's going through a difficult time right now. And so just to frame this, the 5 leadership wisdoms I'm going to offer you. I've been through now, I would say, I've been through multiple downturns. You know, if you've been around as long as I have, you've gone through a bunch of recessions. But I went through 2 once-in-a-lifetime downturns in the same decade, which was the dot-com bust and 9/11 and SARS and a few other things in a recession. All happened back in the early part of the century. Sounds like a long time ago when you say the early part of the century, but it was, 15 to 20 years ago. Really started in 2001. And because we were the largest hotelier in the San Francisco Bay Area, and all of our hotels at that time were in the San Francisco Bay Area, we were particularly vulnerable. But we tripled in size between 2001 and 2006, which was unlike a lot of our competitors. So partly because of the things I'll talk about today. And then in the Great Recession, that was, the biggest downturn, economic downturn the U.S. had seen since the Great Depression. Suffered through that as well. But what I will say is that what we're experiencing right now in the world generally, organizationally specifically, and businesses even more specifically, is like nothing we've seen before. And it's a cliche to even have me belabor that point because you all know that, and it's been written and talked about a lot. I think the real question that I'm going to try to answer here today is the question of how do we help people in a time of such uncertainty and anxiety feel like they can actually operate at their best? And this is not just in terms of the psychosociology and the hygiene, what the psychological hygiene of organizations. I'll talk a little bit about that. But it's truly to give people the sense that they're on the right path. Because one of the things that really does come up in a downturn is people become doubting of themselves and others and of their organizations. And when you create an organization that is full of doubt, as opposed to confidence, it actually becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, and things start to fall apart. So let me start with my first offering of wisdom, and that is that leaders are the emotional thermostats of those they lead. What does that mean? Leaders are the emotional thermostats of those they lead. The higher you are in an organization, the more contagious your emotions, the more impact your emotions have on others. And this is something that a lot of leaders forget about, especially when they're walking down the hallway in thought about something, passing people's desks and not smiling, saying hello. And people then somehow think that they did something wrong because the boss or the CEO or the founder or whomever, she or he didn't actually show any kind of humanity when they were passing by. So people have a tendency, we all do, this is not just people in a company, we all have a tendency to personalize things. So quite often when it comes to a leader, people personalize things when it wasn't even meant to be personalized. But most importantly here, in terms of the emotional thermostat, you're not the temperature, you're the thermostat. The difference is if you're the temperature, and there's lots of people who are great temperature, they're like, they're great, a thermometer. If you're a thermometer, it just means you have a really good ability to understand the culture, and you're probably a bit of an empath in terms of understanding how people are feeling. You have what I call you're good at listening for the field. That's the third form of listening. You can listen inside yourself, you can listen one-on-one with someone else, or you can listen to the field. If we could just maybe mute whoever's got that sound. If it's me, tell me. I hope it's not me. So to be the emotional thermostat's different than a thermometer. A thermostat means you actually set the climate control. It means you have the influence on setting whatever the mood is and the agenda is. So for me, I'm a big believer. I don't think there's a specific way that you do this that is right or wrong. Everybody has different leadership styles. So the one thing I'm going to start by saying is my approach to how I do it might be different than yours. What needs to be true for both of us is it has to come from a place of authenticity, so that it's creating trust and transparency. So first and foremost, trust and transparency are essential during a difficult time. And I'll talk a little bit about this more in terms of why and what are the things that lead to anxiety in organizations. But let me just say, start with trust and transparency. Beyond that, your personality as a leader may be different than mine. Mine was to be a vulnerable visionary. I was once called that in a newspaper article, a vulnerable visionary. And my first reaction was like, oh, wow, I like alliteration, so I didn't mind the fact it was two words with the same first letter. But I initially thought, well, maybe that's not so good, being vulnerable. Well, I actually think vulnerability is a really important component of great leadership. You may feel differently and it may not work for you, but you better do the trust and transparency at minimum. But the reason I think vulnerability works is it actually allows, especially in a difficult time, for people to breathe. I'll never forget, I was speaking to all of our managers, all of our general managers of our hotels, as well as some of our senior leaders in the company. We did an annual management retreat, and it was in November 2008. And we had just opened 15 new hotels, like 15 hotels in a 21-month period, which is a lot of hotels to open. And so all of them were boutique hotels. All of them were spread around California. And I was sitting there's a 3-day retreat we were doing with our manager, actually 2-day retreat that we were doing with our managers. And my top 2 people in the company were 2 women, and they both gave me this sort of a script that I was supposed to say in my hour up in front of this group to start the conference, start the retreat, the management retreat. And what they gave me was something, and I'm not very scripted. So let's start by saying I don't love a script. But secondly, what they really wanted me to do is be a cheerleader. And for me, what it felt like was my role was to go out there and help them feel like 2009 was not going to be as bad as they think it was going to be. At this time, we had just finished getting our budgets approved for the next year. Now we have different owners that we manage hotels for and launch hotels for. And the owners were pretty tough on us. And so we were assuming that between 2008 and 2009, revenues would be sort of flat. Well, as it turns out, revenues dropped by about 22 to 24% in the hotel markets we were in. So the general managers in that room knew at that particular moment, as they were all in the same room together, that they were talking to each other, and they all felt set up for failure, because they could see that in order to get their budget approved by the owner, they had to actually they couldn't say, okay, next year our revenues are going to go down 20%. No owner wanted to hear that, especially for a hotel that actually was just getting launched relative to the budgets that they had. So what I had was a room full of people who felt like the leaders in their company might not know how nervous they were. And so instead of taking that script out to cheerlead, what I did is I went on stage and I just said, listen, I learned, I told them that frankly, 3 months earlier, I had a flatline experience. I had died, which people want to ask about that. And they can ask about that in the chat. What's that like, going to the other side? I had an allergic reaction to an antibiotic I was on because I had a broken ankle and a septic leg. And I told them about that. And then I actually drew on the easel an equation, which was despair equals suffering minus meaning. Despair equals suffering minus meaning. I don't know how many of you, maybe raise your hand if you have, how many of you have actually ever read or know of Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning? So I had that book in my backpack when I ended up in the hospital, and I was in the emergency room and then ICU because of this flatline experience. And when I was reading that book, and I'd read it before, I actually distilled down, probably the most famous book ever written on meaning, to just this simple equation: despair equals suffering minus meaning. If suffering is a constant in life, then meaning and despair are inversely proportional to each other. When you're going through a difficult time, let's do the math on it. Let's say despair is an 8, which means, and let's say suffering's a 10 and meaning's a 2. 10 minus 2 equals 8. If somehow I can actually increase meaning from 2 to 4, then despair goes from 8 to 6. You get it? So that's how the math works here. So I went on stage without a script, and I just said, I had a flatline experience 3 months ago. Only a few of you know that. And I'm nervous, just like you are, about what we're about to go into. But let me actually share this equation with you, because what I want us to do is not just look at how are we going to create personal meaning during this time. I want to actually look at how we're going to create some collective meaning. How we will feel like when we look back at this time 20 years from now, we will say, this was the time I learned the most about being a leader in my life. And we spent the next hour in a conversation between me on stage and then people standing up and talking and finally being able to breathe and being able to talk about what they're going through. Now, that's the vulnerable side. I was willing to be vulnerable myself. I created a welcome mat for all of these leaders in the company to be vulnerable. The visionary side is equally important, because if you're just the vulnerable without the visionary, people actually start to get nervous, because they really do look to leaders to be the person who's going to help us get out of this situation. So I outlined our vision for where we were going in the next 2 years at that point, at the end of 2008, assuming that the recession was going to sort of be a real downturn for a couple of years. And I outlined some of the really interesting new thinking we had about some things that we were going to double down on, and why I felt some confidence about what we were going to be able to do. And when I talk in a couple minutes about the momentum of victory, I'll speak about this a little bit more. But it was really important that this team of people felt like that there was this beautiful alchemy of vulnerability, but also vision, of authenticity and courage or confidence. And that mix, for me as a leader, was what helped us to get through that time and to the point where I could actually ultimately sell the company. So after 24 years as the CEO. So what I would start with, and I'm opening, if anybody has a question on this first point about leaders are the emotional thermostats of those they lead, feel free to go ahead and just write something in the chat. But let me just summarize by saying, this is hard for some people. This is really hard to understand that you have something, you have your own version of a virus. The virus is your emotions. And they sometimes feel like what I'm saying to them is I'm supposed to plaster on a big happy smile and fake it till I make it, so to speak, as I walk through the office. No, I don't want you to be, I'm not asking for you to not be who you are. I am asking you to understand that how you show up will really have a huge influence on others. One of the things that we did as a practice for a month period of time is we got rid of the word manager or leader in the company, and we replaced it with role model. And so for the next 30 days, whenever we used the word, what we would have used for manager or leader, everybody was forced to use the word role model. And it was phenomenal what happened as a result of that in terms of how the leaders felt like they had to embody that kind of role model leadership. So I'm a big believer in servant leadership, so to speak, which means I'm here to serve others. Okay, so I'm going to go to the second one. I don't see any questions yet for this first one, so let's move to the second one. Feel free to continue to use chat if something comes up, though.
Chip?
The second, yes.
A quick question, since we have about 50 people in the chat, if you like it. I was thinking, what is the temperature that people feel right now in terms of them like being in the lead, no matter if it's at home or in their companies? So how do you feel? What's your temperature? How would you describe that? If you want to give us that feedback in the chat, it would be great to see us. What's the temperature of the room right now as we go through the next point? And with that,
and when you say the room, you don't mean this room here, this Zoom room, but you mean the organization you may be involved in.
Right, the organization that you're involved in,
or it could be your family. Literally, it could be your family as well. Oh, actually, Glenn says it's comfortable in 72 degrees. Where the heck are you, Glenn? That's nice. I wish most organizations were that way. So most of them are really chill.
For me, it's in my leadership role, not in the company. The company, okay. Forget it. I'm like super cold. It's super bad. Okay. I don't know which direction you want to go, but it's freezing in Michigan, so it could be that we're freezing.
Yeah. So Adler asked about empathy. It relates to the thermostat. Absolutely, empathy is part of the thermostat. There's an element of, it's not just about actually setting the climate control and the thermostat so you actually set it and you just choose it. It's also knowing what's right for the group. So I also think there's times when, being direct and respectful is another nice alchemy. I think great leaders are alchemists. They know how to actually up the ante on one thing or the other. So there's times when you have to be more direct as an organization. And then there's other times you need to be more respectful. And ideally you mix the two. But empathy is pretty important because it actually sort of speaks to the idea of what's the overall feeling in the org, and what do you need to be as the alchemist. Catherine asks, is hot good? I mean, to me, hot is good when hot tends to mean there's a lot of energy. And people are probably more willing to be direct and sort of, vulnerable in a hot environment. A cold environment actually sort of shuts people down a little bit. So, ideally we can all be like Glenn and be set at 72 degrees and sunny. So what's the ideal temperature for a leader? I think that's really a function of, what does the team need? Do they need a little bit more hot directness, or do they need a little bit more cooling off, and maybe respect and a little bit more space for people to actually feel a little bit of space for themselves? I'm going to move on to the second question, and that is the second leadership lesson. And it's another equation. I promise you, these are the only two equations I have. The first one was disparity equals suffering minus meaning. The second equation is anxiety equals uncertainty times powerlessness. Wow, is this a valuable equation? So as Ingo said, I've written 5 books. My most recent book is called Wisdom at Work, The Making of a Modern Elder, which led us to creating the Modern Elder Academy down here in Baja, where I am. You can learn more about that at the Modern Elder Academy website. But the book before that, which was a New York Times bestseller, was called Emotional Equations. And it was 18 different equations that I'd learned, and I got out and studied. So what I did is I had this flatline experience. I had been figured out this despair equals suffering minus meaning equation in the hospital right after the flatline experience. And then I started going out and studying other emotions, because the truth is we don't learn emotions in a sort of a logical way. You don't in junior high school, you don't have a class on emotions 101. You learn them from your parents, which frankly is sort of scary at times. And so the truth is that I wanted to understand emotions more. So I went out and met with and spent time with the world's leading experts on a series of emotions, whether it was disappointment or happiness or curiosity or anxiety. When it comes to anxiety, there are 98% of anxiety comes from 2 different ingredients: the sense of uncertainty and then the sense of powerlessness. And it's not a plus in between those 2. It's anxiety equals uncertainty times powerlessness, which basically means that if you have them both at the same time, it's combustible and it gets to be a very large number. It also means that if you can actually reduce one or the other to close to 0, the whole equation comes down. So you don't have to reduce both. So what does this mean? Let's move out of the math. And for those of you who would say, I didn't expect a math exercise from Professor Conley here, I promise you this is my last equation. What this means is, how do you, in an uncertain and difficult time, turbulent time, how do you create a little more certainty? How do you create a little bit more powerfulness? And how do you do that as a leader? Well, I'm going to give you some anecdotes around this, and then a specific thing you could do on a personal level. Anecdotally, just know that being more transparent, something I talked about in the first lesson, is really helpful, because frankly, people get more nervous about what they don't know than they do about what they do know, even when it's bad news. Does that make sense? How many, raise your hand if that makes sense. You fit that profile. Yeah, we would much rather, it's twice as painful to not have news as it is to have bad news. So just know the first thing is, if there's bad news to be said and to be expressed, know that people in your organization may already know it, whether it's because word travels fast or because they can just surmise it, because they can just sort of feel it in their bones. So the idea of articulating to people what's happening out there at least allows people to feel less ambiguity. Now, the ambiguity, it may have a lot of ambiguity in other things, but at least knowing the following. And this is why if you're in an organization where you actually have to make major cost cuts and you actually have to basically reduce headcount, so to speak, doing it preferably once, and sort of saying, this is what we're having to do, and then give people confidence that for the next 3 or 6 months or whatever period of time, unless it's a performance related thing, we're not going to do any economic layoffs. And that way people can get to a place of thinking, okay, we've had the bad news, now let's move on. And one of the things I'm going to talk about a little bit later is just the base of the pyramid, of Maslow's pyramid. When people are stuck at the base of the pyramid, it's really hard to move out of survival mode. So long story short is, the first thing to know is anxiety is about uncertainty. The process of actually improving uncertainty is to create some certainty, more transparency. The second piece of this is powerlessness. And what's interesting is learned helplessness is often the first step towards someone becoming depressed. So when you feel a learned helplessness, you actually feel like you don't have any control, power, influence. So the part of the thing a leader has to do is to help people focus on what they can do. What is something you can do today that's going to make a difference? And yes, we can do gratitude lists. I love gratitude lists. that is something within our control. But I'm actually talking right now in the organizational context. What is something you could do today that would make a difference in the company and give you a sense that you had an impact? It's really important for us to sort of help people to see how their work is influencing the company overall. Because otherwise, if you don't feel that way, you don't put a lot of energy into what you're doing. So how do you take this and make it personal? Or how can you do that for a team if you're a leader on a team? Well, we created something called the anxiety balance sheet. And so here's how it works. You have, for uncertainty, you have a list of things that you're uncertain of and things that you are certain of. So you create like an assets and liabilities. You just make a list. What are the things, think about, first of all, let's say that the thing that you're concerned or worried about, the thing that's bringing you anxiety, is you think that you may lose your job. So you'd make a list of things. Here's the thing I have some uncertainty about, and here's the things I have some certainty about. You make those two lists. On the powerlessness side, you would say, okay, what is it that I have no power over? And then what is it that I have some influence over? And when people do this exercise, and I've done this exercise for over 1,000 people in companies in the past, what's surprising is when people have a half hour to truly come up with their lists, they usually have more things on the positive side, the things that are certainty, or the things that provide some sense of influence, than they do on the negative side, the things that are uncertain or powerlessness. And then the question that comes up is like, okay, so the things that are uncertain or you have powerless, can you influence those? Do you have any influence? And if the answer is no, it's the thing to do is to learn how to let it go. You know, for those who know the serenity prayer, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. The wisdom is knowing the difference, knowing what are the things you can control and things you can't control. The most crazy making thing you can ever do is try to change things that you have no control over. So I'm going to open up for questions on anxiety and uncertainty. Let's see if anybody has, and powerlessness. So Ingo, I see you said Virginia has a good point. In many organizations, people never see how they can make a difference, sadly. Virginia, you want to say anything more about that? Virginia Hamilton, you're welcome to if you'd like.
Sure. I mean, I work largely with people in government, and I would suggest, I mean, I love your idea of actually trying to see where people feel like they can influence something, but I work with a lot of people who feel like they don't have any agency at all.
Exactly. Agency is thank you, Virginia. That agency is a really important word. Agency, and I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. Here's where you have some agency. You have some agency in your relationships with the other people you work with. You have some agency over your mindset and whether you actually feel good about your work. Now, there are toxic situations that people are in, and it's really hard to have a positive perspective when you're full of toxicity, or you've been subjected to a learned helplessness kind of environment. But I think that the number one thing that I think people can influence that they actually don't usually consider is my relationships with my coworkers. How can I show up as a more positive influence with the people who I work with? Because that is something you have some influence over. Catherine asks, is this where emotional intelligence comes from? Yeah, you know, one of the things that's quite interesting, a stat that I didn't say for the first one, that I'll say now, is Daniel Goleman's work was the person who really popularized emotional intelligence. He was not the first person to write about it, though. But when he actually did his studies at Harvard that looked at leaders and emotional intelligence, what he was able to show was that 2/3 of the success of a leader is due to their emotional intelligence. And only 1/3 is due to the combination of their level of experience in their work and their IQ. So IQ and the level of experience they have in their work only represent 1/3, whereas 2/3 of the success of leaders had to do with their EQ. So what we're talking about here, both in these first 2 points, speak to this idea of EQ. And emotional intelligence really has 4 components to it. One is knowing what's going on inside of yourself, which is really another way to say emotional fluency, being fluent in your emotions, self-aware. Secondly, knowing how your emotions show up to others. frankly, someone who's not got a high IQ doesn't know how they come across to others. When in doubt, when someone says, I want to have better EQ, have them do the following exercise. Have them make a list of, and you can do this for yourself too. Make a list of the 5 adjectives you'd like people to use to describe you in the working world. What are the 5 adjectives that you want to represent your reputation or your brand, personal brand? And then go out and survey a minimum of a dozen people or more who actually work with you regularly. These could be customers as well, but they're going to be coworkers. If you have that many coworkers, if you're, say, a solo practitioner consultant, then it might be your clients. And then ask them what 5 adjectives they use to describe you, and figure out a way for them to be anonymous on this. Now, that's something you'll have to figure out. And then see what those adjectives are that people describe you as, and compare them with your 5 adjectives. And then ask yourself, wow, if no one said any of your 5 adjectives, then you start looking at your 5 adjectives and asking yourself the question, how could I be more decisive if that's one of my 5? Or how could I be more empathetic? What are the behaviors? What are the habits? How could I be better at recognizing people? So that was one of mine. I'm not great at recognizing people. When I say recognizing, I don't mean like, oh, Laura, I see you there, Laura. Alfano, I recognize her. She's in the Brady Bunch boxes here. That's not the kind of recognizing I'm talking about. I'm talking about saying to Laura or someone else, Laura's on my team, you did a great job, Laura. I tend to treat people like I treat myself, and I'm a bit of a slave driver of myself. Long story short is, I had to build a habit. And the habit I built was twice a day, I'm going to give some kind of personal recognition privately to 2 different people, just to say thank you for something they did, or at least call out something that I saw that was really great. So that's a behavior that can then back up such that people feel like, oh, Chip's pretty generous with his recognition, which I still am not that great at. So I'm going to see if there's any other questions we have here. Building habits is key, Peter says. Thank you. Virginia, I'm glad you've been here for, I know you have to go early. I'm going to move on to the 3rd one because I'm just like chatty Cathy here. Sorry about that. So 3rd is create a moment. So Laura knows, I had no idea Laura was going to be on the call here, but she knows last week I sent an email out to our Modern Elder Academy team. And that email went out and said, in the midst of all the crap we're dealing with right now, and we're business right now, we have no revenue coming in, and we're not until mid-October. Ouch, that's really expensive. So I sent an email out to our team, our leaders, and I just said, here's all the good news. Here's a bunch of stuff that's going on right now that's really a positive. Because the momentum of victory means the following. When the world is falling apart, you have a tendency to think in dire terms around your company and your business. And you don't even know or even recognize when there's actually some good news out there. So being able to help people to see a little victory, a little win, that actually is an evidence that something positive is happening is really critical for people, because it actually creates the psychohygiene, a word that Abraham Maslow, who I'll talk about in a moment, coined long ago. The psychohygiene in an organization is really important. And when the psychohygiene comes from a place of like, wow, I'm on a winning team, winning creates more winning, because it creates confidence and it creates a sense that, okay, we have some agency here. We have some ability to actually get better. There's a interesting story. When I was writing one of my books called Peak, How Great Companies Get Their Mojo from Maslow, I studied Continental Airlines, which back then, 20 years ago, when I was studying them 15 to 20 years ago, was like the worst airline in the world, and like had no good metrics. They became a great company over time until they combined with United, and then unfortunately had to become a part of the United clan, which was not a good thing for the Continental team, because they'd done a great job of making a comeback. The first thing that the CEO did when he actually joined the company, and they'd had 10 CEOs in 10 years, not a good sign. the CEO took on the idea that we're going to actually focus first on improving the employee lunchrooms and workspaces. So we're going to actually put dollars not toward our customers, not toward giving more money to our investors. We're going to start by actually improving the quality of the employee workspaces, and especially the communal spaces like a lunchroom or an employee break room. And then they focused on like, okay, what is it the employees want? And what he was able to show is we could make some strides pretty quickly as a company around our employees. And if you can do that first, what you end up doing is creating a bit of a tailwind of a momentum of victory. There's all kinds of data on this that show that when a company, or let's say a sports team, a lot of the analogies are usually in the sports world. When a sports team actually starts to get on a winning streak, when all things are equal, they actually do better moving forward because they have more confidence. That can be used in the context of an organization as well. One of the metaphors I like to use here is comes from crew or from rowing. So in rowing and crew, what is interesting is when a crew is in unison, and the coxswain, usually there's 8 people in a crew, and the coxswain sort of telling them when to stroke, stroke, stroke. When they actually are in unison, the boat starts to actually elevate in the water. And when that happens, it's called swing. When the boat swings, it starts to elevate out of the water because everybody's in unison on their rowing. Because the boat's no longer being weighed down as much, it has less friction with the water and it moves faster. And this is another metaphor that sort of gives you a sense that if you get people aligned and feeling great about what we're doing as an organization, they have the confidence and the sense of unity to move forward without friction. So any questions on that third one? Anybody? So I see a message from Vibeke. Remember, to some people, praise in private doesn't count. Great point. Some people like public recognition. Some people like private recognition. I think that you've got to be thoughtful. A great leader customizes their approach to everything they do to the individual standing in front of them or the individual they're conceiving. So the way it works is not, oh, Virginia Hamilton, you're coming here. Oh my gosh, that's who you are. I love it. I love it. Thanks for being here. Vibeke, back to you. Yes, for some people, they don't want it in private. They want it in public. They want to be on stage with you and get some big award. That's why it's important to be able to offer both kinds of recognition. I'm going to move on to the fourth one. So for the fourth one, I wish I had a slide. I don't. I'm just going to use my hands. But imagine a pyramid or a triangle. If you remember, how many of you remember Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Raise your hand. Most of you do. So Abraham Maslow famously was the first person well, not the first. He was not the first, but he was the first who popularized the premise that psychology could be used for positive, not just for negative. Prior to Maslow coming along, most psychologists studied deficiencies, whether it's Skinner or Freud. The point of view they had was deficiency. How are you deficient? And in what way are you deficient? And how does that mean, by being deficient, let's study your faults and learn from those faults. Well, it's almost like looking at, if you looked at a company, you'd say, let's focus only on worst practices, not best practices. So Maslow came along, created his hierarchy of needs, studied 1,000 people, and was able to see that 1,000 people who had flourished in their life, historically and present day, mid-20th century. And what he saw was this hierarchy of needs: physiological needs, safety needs, social belonging needs, esteem needs, and self-actualization at the top. Later in life, he had a 6th and 7th and an 8th level even. And transcendence was at the top. Long story short is, during the downturn of dot-com bust 9/11, I took Maslow's hierarchy of needs and tried to distill it down to 3 key themes. The themes being survival, succeed, transform. Survival, succeed, transform. So just make a little note to yourself in a pyramid right now. Survival, succeed, transform. And then we applied that pyramid to our three most important stakeholders. In our case, that was our employees, our customers, and our investors. And we started asking the question for our employees, what's the survival need for our employees? Happened to be money or compensation. What's the succeed need for our employees? Recognition. What's the transformational need for our employees? It's meaning. So the employee pyramid is money at the base, recognition in the middle, meaning at the top. And we started operating with that as our model, which basically meant, let's make sure that everybody has their survival needs met, but let's also recognize that we should, in a downturn, everybody tends to focus at the bottom of the pyramid. And if you can get the bottom of the pyramid right, like if people feel a sense that they're being well compensated, given the times, and they don't have worries that the company's going to go out of business or they're going to lose their job, what people end up doing is they end up feeling like they can move to the next level of the pyramid. And what you want to do in a downturn is help people up this pyramid, because the base of the pyramid is a job, the middle of the pyramid is a career, and the peak of the pyramid is a calling. Southwest Airlines, using the airline metaphor, I spent a ton of time with Southwest Airlines. They are in the business of helping their employees live their calling. United Airlines flight attendants do not feel like they're living their calling. You create an environment where people are moving up that pyramid, you create a peak performing company, which allows you to get to the peak of the pyramid for the customers and for the investors as well. The customer pyramid, I'll just be brief on that one. I won't talk about the investor one, is the base of the pyramid is meeting their expectations. The middle of the pyramid is meeting the customer's desires. And the peak of the pyramid is meeting their unrecognized needs, meaning you knew more about your customers than they knew about themselves. So as you can tell, to me, psychology is a really important part of being a great leader. And however you want to look at this, you could look at vendors, you could look at the community. If you're a governmental or a nonprofit organization, it could be that you have something other than employees and customers that you want to actually create a pyramid around. But keep just coming back to survival, success, transformation. And what is it that you could actually provide that would actually meet those needs for that particular constituency? Any questions on the peak model? I'm going to go to the fifth thing, and then we'll open it up in the last few minutes for other questions. The most important question a leader can ask the people that they're leading is the following: how can I support you to do the best work of your life here at fill in the blank? Airbnb, here at McDonald's, here at my old company, Joie de Vivre. How can I support you to do the best work of your life here at fill in the blank? Why is that a powerful question? Go back to what Virginia said earlier. Virginia mentioned agency. When someone doesn't feel they have a sense of agency, they feel powerless. And so the first part of this is really helping people to see that you, their boss, wants them to succeed. It's amazing. 72% of people think their boss wants them to fail. That's a really bad statistic. Like, as the boss, you know that if your direct report's failing, it actually isn't good news for you necessarily. So the first part is, how can I support you? Helps people to understand that your role as the boss is to help them be successful. That's what servant leadership is about. The next part of the question, how can I support you to do the best work of your life? To do the best work of your life? Wow, that's a high stretch. You mean you want me to do the best work of my life in a downturn? Yes, I want to say that for myself too. I want us all to do the best work of our life right now. So I think what's really interesting about this piece is sometimes people need someone to help push them a little bit to stretch into their potential. When you can stretch into your potential, you're feeling a sense of engagement and flourishing in life. And there's no doubt, actually, Joseph Campbell long ago said, people aren't looking for meaning in their life. They're actually looking to feel fully alive and fully useful. And so helping people to see that it's not just that I'm here to support you, but I want you to do the best work of your life. And then here at whatever the company is. The meta question here that really brings us together, the third piece of this, is the agency piece. Because how many of us have worked in a workplace where we felt like it was our boss who's supposed to figure out all the answers? But when your boss comes to you and says to you, hey, how can I support you to do the best work of your life? You are giving agency to the person who works for you to help you understand what it is they need. Now, some leaders tell me, I hate this question, Chip, because they're going to come back to me with a bunch of things that I can't deliver on. Great. You're going to have a very important conversation then, because now you're going to take what was subconscious and make it conscious. And you'll be able to explain, why can't you do these things? But some of the things on the list are like, hey, we have once a month meeting. I'd like to have twice a month a meeting with you. Deliver, check. You can do that one. The 50% raise in pay, maybe you can't do that one. But the fact that they actually want to go to one professional development workshop a year and they're not doing any right now, probably can do that. The fact that they actually want to work from home one day a week, or they want to be able to leave by 5 p.m. twice a week because they need to be back for their kids, probably can do that. They don't think they can do that because they haven't had the conversation and they see that you're staying till 7:30 every night. And they feel like that's what they have to do. So just know that when you ask this question, how can I support you to do the best work of your life? You are helping people to have agency, not learned helplessness, and the ability to have a conversation with you that actually could be quite fruitful to helping them feel more engaged. Now I'm going to just shut up. I'm sorry. And open it up to see if there's any questions on any of this, including the most recent one. So you can use the chat function for this.
Yes. So if you have questions to Chip, no matter where you are right now, what are you going through in your business or in your life dealing with a leader, maybe right now, let us know either through the chat or by unmuting yourself and letting us know your question. So Marianne asked, what was point number 3, Chip? I missed it.
Okay, point number 3 was the momentum of victory. So to create a momentum of victory, which helps people to feel like, oh, small successes, small wins are happening.
Right. And while we're on this note, Stephanie asked, can you summarize all points briefly for her probably to take the note?
Yes. So the 5 points are: leaders are the emotional thermostats of those they lead. Number 2 is anxiety equals uncertainty times powerlessness. Number 3 is create a momentum of victory. Number 4 is create a peak model based upon create a hierarchy of, I'll make it simpler. Create a hierarchy of needs for your key stakeholders. And then the 5th one is, how can I support you to do the best work of your life here at whatever company? And that's a question you would ask your direct reports.
We have a question from Adler who asks, besides of creating a safe environment, how can you foster empowerment on your team, getting them to be proactive, more collaborative, and showing up with ideas?
You know, I think the key is to help people to see that that collaboration is going to be rewarded. You know, in many organizations, there's sort of a rugged individualist, and there's, individual contributors. In tech companies, they call these IC, an individual contributor. And there's a sense that somehow we're all, not in this together, but we're all sort of separate. And so one of the things that we did at Joie de Vivre in my company is when we evaluated performance, we actually looked at two key metrics. One was results, and the other was relationships. And we actually you could be scored from 1 to 4 on results and a 1 to 4 on relationships. Relationships spoke to what kind of peer feedback we heard about you. It spoke to how did the teams that you're on, how did they perform? So it was not just your own personal performance. It spoke to exit interviews we heard from people on your team about who they liked. It spoke to a question that we asked on our employee satisfaction surveys, which was, beyond your boss, who in the company do you turn to for advice or wisdom? So what the point of this is, what I'm talking about here shows up in my book called The Rebel Rules, Daring to Be Yourself in Business, which is my first book from 20 years ago. What that speaks to is, if you have 4 scores for results and 4 scores for relationships, in order to grow in the company, you had to prove that you were in the first quadrant, which meant you scored a 1 or a 2 on results and relationships. If you were just a great results person, but you were terrible at relationships and not good at collaboration, then you couldn't grow in the company. Now, not many companies do that because they get very fixated on personal contributions. But I'm a big believer in invisible productivity, which basically means there are certain people out there, when you put them on a team, the team does better because that person is a model for collaboration. So that's what I would say.
We have a question here from Irene who asks, I agree with showing vulnerability to your team, but how much is too much?
Yeah. Well, I think that, again, this is why I say it's really important to personalize this in a way that, is specific to you. I think it's alchemy. So vulnerable visionary. If you're good at setting the thermostat, and if you're good at empathy, you know what your people need right now. If what they really need is confidence and some level of trust that the organization is being well managed logically and there's a good plan in place for the future, then vulnerability is probably not what they need right now. On the other hand, generally speaking, and this is not true across everybody, but organizations that are dominated by men can use a little more vulnerability. And sometimes certain organizations that are dominated by women, sometimes could use a little bit more of the vision side of things, or the confidence, but it's really hard to generalize. And that gender thing I just said is not true of everybody at all. But what I can say pretty strongly as a man is absolutely most organizations that are male dominated could use a little bit more transparency, vulnerability, and the sense that there's a collaboration spirit, which, women are so much better at collaboration than men generally in organizations.
Since you talked about women, I want to pick the last question here, given that we're running up to the full hour, which is from Lindsay. And she asked, very helpful advice on how to lead our team during these times. Any advice on how to handle ourselves as leaders and staying strong as we navigate our way through these uncertain times?
Well, it's, the silly metaphor about being on the airplane and you gotta, get your air first. This makes sense in the sense that the thing I would recommend to people is, you know yourself better than I do. So I'm not going to tell you what's the right mix, but know what regenerates your batteries. Just know what are those things that regenerate your batteries. For me, it's a run on the beach. It's a swim. It's usually to something physical. Meditation works for me, and I try to do it every morning and sometimes in the afternoon. I need sometimes to block off a whole afternoon just for thinking and writing time. I'm a big writer. So that's what I need. So, you can be a spectacular empath for what other people need. But if you're not applying that to yourself, you're going to actually run out of fuel. And as both Ingo and Laura know, I believe midlife is a marathon. It's not 45 to 65, it's 35 to 75. And so if you're running a marathon, you better actually know how to pace yourself and have little stops along the way for water and food and etc. to just continue to energize yourself again, because self-care, without the self-care, you can't be there for others.
Okay, with that, I want to be mindful of the time, of our time and your time, Chip. So first, I want to say thank you to everybody who joined us today, to you, Chip, especially. Thank you for giving us an hour of your time and sharing some of your wisdom, your insights. And I hope it will multiply through the participants that we had today, who will hopefully apply some of that with their teams, with their families, or with the organizations they work for. Also, as always, we'll send a follow-up with the recording of this session. And I would like us to include some of the resources Chip mentioned. And Chip, a last question to you. Where can people go if they want to get more of your insights when it comes to leadership? What's the number one URL or page?
I would say go to Wisdom Well. So I write a daily blog, and it comes out every morning. And if you subscribe to it, it's free. You get an email that actually sends it. And people sort of think of it as like their microdose of wisdom in the morning. And you can find Wisdom Well on the Modern Elder Academy website. And then just sign up for it there. The Modern Elder Academy website is also a great place to learn about the workshops that we will be starting again in the fall. And there's a Chip Conley website and LinkedIn. So I put on LinkedIn most of the posts that I write as well.
Great. Thank you so much again, Chip. And to all of you, have a beautiful day, afternoon, or evening, no matter where you are in this world. Thank you for joining us today.
Yep. Thank you.